My name is Jolene. I create content for on Target Digital Marketing, and I'll be introducing the next speaker. Lauren Gay is a lifestyle influencer who blogs at the misadventures of the Outdoorsy Diva. A travel writer, travel blogger, content creator, public speaker, and podcaster, Lauren's podcast was recently featured by the BBC. Please welcome to Florida Blogcon, Lauren Gay.
Good afternoon. I'm Lauren. I hope you're all awake. It's after lunch, so I know some of you might be feeling it a little bit, but it wasn't real meat, so you can't have Thanksgiving-itis. So it should be good, right?
Right? Instead we have ice cream.
So, as she said, I am the creator of Misadventures of an Outdoorsy Diva. That is my travel and adventure blog where I share about my travels and adventures all over the world. I try to get people out of their comfort zones. I am a promoter of diversity and inclusion in the outdoor space and dispelling myths of what they say Black people don't do because... So real quick, just to get a pulse of the room, who already has a podcast? Okay. So the rest of you have blogs, yes? Yep. Okay, and you're thinking about whether or not you should expand and also start a podcast. So my podcast is of the same name. Some people do it with different names. Mine's exactly the same. So it is also the Outdoorsy Diva podcast. It's about a year old. I am on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, all of them. Everyone except Pandora, but hopefully soon I have my application in. It's a new thing, yeah. So you can now, Pandora is aggregating podcasts as well. So hopefully you'll give it a listen, not required, but shameless plug. The way that I use my podcast, just to give you a little background, so how it came about, and I'll just get this out of the way, why did I start a podcast personally? Well, I've had the blog for almost 5 years, and not full time. I do still have a big girl job to keep the lights on and feed my son who plays college football. But hopefully one day I can just do Outdoorsy Diva. That would be the dream. But I was asked to be on a radio show for Spectrum Radio, and it aired at some ungodly time of morning, like 6 a.m. or something on a Sunday. And I'm thinking, no one will hear it. I agreed to it. Sure, I can do that. So I was interviewed and asked to talk about one of my posts, which was about how my love of nature saved my life. It was mental health awareness, and it's about why I decided to trek off to the Azores Islands by myself and get away from the world for a week and how that moment changed my life. So I went on this radio show. I thought nobody's gonna hear it. It airs at 6 a.m. on a Sunday. I go to church, I'm not up at 6 a.m. on a Sunday. So it aired and my inbox blew up. And I was like, who are these people listening to the radio at 6 a.m. on a Sunday? But I was touched because I got so many messages of God sent you to me. I need to hear that right now. I was on my last leg. I had one and I get kind of choked up about it. This woman told me, she was thinking about giving up, like giving up, ending her life. And hearing my voice and what I had to say changed her life. So for me, that was eye-opening because that was a whole different space that I never considered at all. I only knew of the written medium, right? Or video, social media, but using my voice, which I personally am not a fan of my voice, but using my voice and people responding to it in that way, it was like, oh, well, this is another avenue you should pursue. So I have a very good friend of mine, theme park hipster, Her hubby's back there in the house, represent for your life. And she has an amazing podcast as well. And so she was like, well, I've been telling you need to do a podcast. And I was like, okay, fine, Nikita, show me how to do a podcast. So that is how the Outdoorsy Diva Travel and Adventure podcast was born. I use it as an extension of my existing brand. And so that's what I'm here to talk to you about today. If you don't already have a brand of some kind, it doesn't have to be a blog necessarily, but it'll still apply. And if you don't and you're just a podcaster, that's fine too. But mainly I'm coming from the perspective of, I already have a brand. How will adding a podcast benefit me or add into helping me to grow my brand? So enough about me. So what we're going to cover today is podcasting right for your brand. Just because it's the end thing, it may not be. I'm going to tell you the truth. The benefits of podcasting for your brand, crucial considerations when you're starting your podcast, because there are things you want to think about ahead of time and not after, so hopefully you'll learn from my mistakes. Things that you should do for absolutely every episode, tools for promoting your podcast, and then how you capitalize on it once you have started your podcast. So is podcasting right for your brand? Why do you want to start a podcast? It seems like it's the end thing to do, right? There's a staggering amount of new podcasts coming on the scene every day. I feel like there's new groups, new this. Everybody I know who has any kind of platform, even famous people, Jamel Hill now has a podcast. And I was like, how am I supposed to compete with that? Like, really? So you have everyone from, the regular people, Joe Schmoes in the world, like us, starting podcasts, to celebrities. So you have to have a very clear purpose on why you're doing this. What is your intent? Are you wanting to do this because everybody's telling you it's the hot thing and it's the end thing? Or do you have something to say? What is your deeper purpose? What are you trying to convey? Because I'm going to be honest with you as we go on, it's a lot of work. And you have to understand that it's an additional commitment, right? So if you already have a brand, and now you're going to give yourself something else to do, you're hazing yourself. I'm just going to tell you the truth. So there has to be some underlying passion and love and reason for why you're doing it, or you won't continue it. You won't be successful, not because your content's not good, but because you won't be consistent, and your audience is going to know that it's kind of your second redheaded stepchild, you know what I'm saying? So you want to have a very clear thought process before you even get started of, why do I want to do this? And then hold tight to that for those really tough days, and remember why you're doing this. Because when you have a deeper meaning, then the rest of that stuff, it doesn't matter, because you know that you have a reason, you have a purpose. So the other thing about podcasting, and if it's right for you, you have to know your audience. I pulled some of these figures from Buzzsprout. They had a pretty good 2019 roundup of some really interesting statistics. So listener composition by race and ethnicity. 59% of podcast listeners are white, and this is for the United States. African American, 12%. Hispanic, Latinx, it should say, 11%. Asian, 7%. Other, 7%. Refuse to answer, 4%. So know your target audience. I would hope that any of you that have a brand, have a podcast, know who you're talking to. You know who you're marketing to. You know who you're sharing with. Who are you trying to talk to? If you're going to add a podcast, are you targeting this same group? Are you looking to target a different market? But whatever you're going to do, know who that audience is. If your audience really doesn't fit this demo, maybe it's not right for you, or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe if you know for a fact that 99.9% of your readers are white, then you have to know, I'm entering a very saturated space. So then you have to think, what's my differentiator? What's going to make me stand out? What's going to be my niche? Why does anybody want to listen to me? For me, my target audience is 65% women, and it is about 75% African American. 12% listeners are African American. You may think, then why would you start a podcast? Aha, because that's a very small segment. That means I can go in there and dominate. You know why? Because they're looking for me. They're looking for other podcasters that fit that niche. So that's what you have to think about. If you're going to enter into this space, what can I do? Is it going to, you have to be strategic about it, is what I'm trying to say. There's not really a no, but I mean, let's just be honest. If your core audience is one that does not fit the demographics, if you look at age, don't do it. Why are you doing it? So just make sure that you're being strategic about that. Be sure that your podcast is going to fit your target demographic. And lastly, crowdsource the existing audience that you already have. So I have a blog. I also have a Facebook group that complements the blog. I have an Instagram audience, stories, all these things. So you're already talking to your audience, you're already engaging with people. Ask those people if they want you to start a podcast. Maybe they don't. Maybe they don't care. Maybe they're not interested. Maybe that's not content that they want to get from you. It might hurt your feelings. It'll save you some time. You know, just be honest. But if you talk to them and they're like, yes, that would be great. I would love to hear more about your behind the scenes adventures, which is things I talk about, then yeah, that's why I did it. And I did crowdsource before I started to see what do y'all want to know. And they were like, we know that you're being PC on your blog. We want to know what really happens. You know, we want to get into the nitty gritty. We want to hear behind the scenes, or we want to hear you collaborate and talk to other people like you. So crowdsource your existing audience and leverage that. Just some other interesting statistics. 56% of podcast listeners are male, while 44% are female. 34 million women in the United States are monthly podcast listeners. Women podcast listeners have a higher education and income than the general U.S. population. I'll leave that for a second. Y'all taking pictures, yes. And again, yeah, go ahead.
Is there any, are there any instruments with regards to demographics that would also be able to at least identify different niche or target audiences that are specific to, say, travel, fashion, parenting, things
For
like
your
that?
own brand or for the podcast?
For the podcast, is there any way to measure what that looks like on podcasts across?
So once you have, like, if for your podcast, if you had a podcast.
Well, because you had, well, I'm just curious, is
Or
there,
just in general?
in general, is there any instrument that says, hey, on
Probably.
podcasts?
I'm sure that someone breaks them down even further, and you can try Buzzsprout, and you can just honestly a quick Google search. I don't have a tool. If you're talking about your own stuff, Google Analytics is going to be your friend for your existing audience. If you're talking about your podcast, that's going to depend on your hosting, which is to see those measurements. I use Lipson. They do a pretty good job. It depends. They have tiers, and so the more money you pay, the more information they give you. I'm somewhere in the middle for what makes sense. So I have enough information for what I personally need. But to answer your question, a few other interesting facts. The state of podcasting, if you look at the countries, I just thought this was really interesting. South Korea is really into podcasts. 56% of worldwide podcast downloads are coming from South Korea. And you can see the other countries. So, if you know your demographics for your existing blog or product that you sell and you market and target some of these other countries, maybe a podcast is a really good idea for you if you have a lot of Australian, readers already and you're going to introduce a podcast. Great Britain, United Kingdom, not so much. But it doesn't mean not to. It's just interesting to kind of see where we fall as a country in terms of the usage of podcast downloads. This, very interesting. Annual household income of podcast listeners. So if you look at sum total, 35% of the listeners of podcasts make over 6 figures. You know what that means? They have disposable income. So you know what that means? You need to be using your podcast to make money. Not just advertising or looking for sponsors, but from your listeners. What do you have that you can offer them? In addition to your amazing voice and your stories, do you have a product? You have a product to sell. So that's what you want to keep in mind strategically if you're talking about using your podcast to leverage for your brand. So, and just to piggyback off of that, so 38% of people who listen to podcasts state that they have purchased products or services mentioned on those podcasts. That is also an incentive for you when you're looking at guests to have, when you're looking at sponsors to have, when you're looking at trying to get people to be on your show or support your show or advertise on your show. You can say, well, hey, you know, people like to buy stuff. You got a really good chance of somebody buying things from you if I have mentioned you or have you as a guest on my podcast. Also, things to consider. Top podcasting genres. Kids and family, science, healthy living, society and culture, news and politics, arts, games and hobbies, business, sports, religion. So these were the top, I believe that's 10 of all the genres. That doesn't mean that if yours doesn't fall into one of these that it's not important and that you shouldn't do it, because again, it's all about having a niche and finding your audience, but just something to think about how saturated that area may be that you're attempting to get into. So the benefits, why would you do this? The obvious one, you're just adding another medium of media that's going to introduce your audience to your content. Your audience who listens to podcasts, they may be auditory people, they're not visual people, and they may never read your entire blog post. People have told me that. People that I've known for years that I know love me and support me, they're like, I'm not a reader, but they'll listen to a podcast. So that's perfect time to repurpose your content. You don't have to reinvent the wheel, especially if you have an existing blog with hundreds and hundreds of posts. You got hundreds and hundreds of podcast episodes. Boom, done, easy. Those become your show notes. Your blog becomes, you just condense that to the important parts. That's what becomes your show notes for your podcast. So it is a perfect way if you are someone who has existing content that you can leverage your podcast to get that same content out in front of a completely different audience who otherwise would have never read a word that you wrote. You also have an opportunity to dominate in a niche with less competition. So what I mean, for me, I'm classified travel blogger. So if y'all saw all of us get up today, that's a microcosm of the world. There are a lot of us out there, a lot. Podcasts, not so much. They're just catching on, and I'm already a year ahead of them. So completely different way, right, for me to kind of break in, differentiate myself. Now when I'm pitching to a brand, I have something else to offer. Yeah, I'll do these pictures and I'll write these posts. And if you pay me this other X amount of dollars, we could do like a live podcast from your property. What do you think? So you have something else to offer, and brands like that. They like extra stuff that they never thought about. And for them, I feel like they're always on the 8 ball, the behind the 8 ball when it comes to like what's on the cutting edge of newness. So for real, everybody, I'm like, well, I have a podcast, and they're like, what? You have a podcast? That's great. So to them, it's like new, even though it's really not new at all. But using it in this way for the position of an influencer is still fresh. And so this is an opportunity for you to capitalize on that. And then we already talked about it as another opportunity to monetize your brand and cross-sell your product. So if you sell t-shirts, you sell a course, a workshop, whatever it is that you have another medium to get those products out in front of people. Crucial considerations when you're starting a podcast. First things first, you have to have a host. Choose that hosting company carefully. You want to ensure your podcast is available across as many outlets as possible with least amount of work for you. So you don't want to have to go manually push all your stuff to all these different places to make sure that you can be found by all the various podcast aggregators, and they are not all created equal. So research it. Don't just dive in like I did first with a smaller one that once I got on there, I